right, it's my privilege. I'm delighted to introduce Noelle Haviland, who's studying history and data science here at Calvin. Noelle, who is from East Lansing, approached me last year about doing an honors project in the archives. It would include researching and writing a thesis, of course, but also digital humanities or a digital archive component. I immediately thought about two magazines that we have in the archives from the late 1910s and 1920s, one called Religion and Culture, the other one called The Witness. They provide an interesting window into Dutch Reformed history, and I've been thinking that they should be digitized and thinking that they'd make a great honors project. And they're the Goldilocks-sized amount of material, not too little, but not too much. And happily, when I described the idea to Noelle, she thought it sounded interesting. And off she was, and off we went. I've enjoyed getting to know Noelle over the past year. I've learned, kind of like Kate said, that she's got a keen and curious mind. Equally important, as anyone who's done an honors thesis knows, she's resilient and persistent. It's a lot of work. The work doesn't always go as you expect. You run into roadblocks. There's always more to do. And of course, you've got other things to do as well with other classes and there's life. So I've been proud to see Noelle persist through the difficult stretches, to see her think insightfully about the research, to talk with her about how she sees the material coming together, and really, especially to see her run, to see her fly when it's going great, and instead of work, it's just fun. Good intellectual fun. So Noelle is going to share her research with you today, and also talk a bit about the digital history archiving component of the project. After Calvin, she plans to pursue a master's degree in data science at Michigan Technological University in Houghton in the Upper Peninsula. I'm just thinking, what a great place to live for a few years. In her future career, she hopes to use her computing, data analysis, and research skills to keep discovering and keep telling stories. Noelle's project is entitled, this is the version I have, Debating Worldliness, Hyperion Ideas and Controversy in the Christian Reformed Church, 1919 to 1925. Please join me in welcoming Noelle.
Hi, I'm Noelle Haviland, and today I will be presenting my honors thesis, Debating Worldliness, Hyperion Ideas and Controversy in the Christian Reformed Church from 1919 to 1925. In June 1922, the Christian Reformed Church Synod fired Ralph Jansen from his position as professor of Old Testament at Calvin Seminary for insubordination and unreformed teaching. Jansen and his teachings first came under subject of controversy in 1919. Four of his colleagues at the seminary accused him of numerous theological errors, including implicitly denying the authority of Scripture by comparing Old Testament books to contemporary literature, and worst of all, placing the importance of reason above that of Scripture. The four professors, pictured here, twice asked the Curatorium, the Board of Trustees, and Synod to investigate Jansen's teaching. While the Curatorium noted some concerns with Jansen's teaching, both it and Synod affirmed his orthodoxy in 1920. The controversy continued, mainly in pamphlets and magazine articles, forcing Synod to take up the issue again in 1922. Frustrated, Jansen refused to cooperate the second time and was let go. This controversy was part of a wider debate that occurred within the Christian Reformed Church regarding the doctrine of common grace, which can be seen in two magazines, Religion and Culture and Witness. The common grace issue arose from differing interpretations of Abraham Kuyper's theology on what it means for Reformed Christians to live in the world. And at first glance, it appears to be a purely theological issue. However, it is best viewed in connection with larger sociocultural questions, including the extent to which Dutch Reformed immigrants ought to Americanize and adjust to modern life or remain separate from it. The 1910s and 20s were decades of major social change in America. The progressive reform movement brought greater awareness to social and economic issues like labor laws, the plight of the poor, and post-World War I American society underwent significant modernization. The Dutch Reformed had a tendency to respond to social questions like Americanization through a theological lens. As they processed these changes, tensions rose between individuals of different mentalities. More conservative groups were suspicious of both outside culture and modernization, while more progressive ones used common grace as an argument for participating in American culture to an extent, while still harboring suspicion of some aspects of modernity. These debates came to a head in 1920, at the same time the American fundamentalist movement was gaining traction. Fundamentalists differed from mainline conservative Protestants in their tendency to view the world in terms of spiritual warfare and viewing mere coexistence with modernists as promoting modernism. The more conservative Dutch Reformed factions shared this distrust, as did the more progressive ones, but to a lesser degree. However, the debate cannot be viewed as an example of the fundamentalist movement, described by scholars like James Marsden. The fundamentalists feared the diminishing influence of mainline Protestantism, whereas the members of the CRC believed that American Protestantism was already too secular and shallow. To properly understand the debates about Jansen and common grace, it's essential to understand the Kuyperian theology being interpreted. Kuyper's theology is complex and often contradictory, allowing people to draw different conclusions from reading the same work. The most important part to understand is his emphasis on articulating a worldview where Reformed Christian faith shapes all spheres of life, including work, home, government, education, etc., not just religious activity. Reformed Christians can participate in these spheres through Reformed organizations or through cooperation with non-Reformed Christians or even non-Christians. Cooperation is acceptable under the doctrine of common grace, the idea that God extends a non-saving form of grace to all people, regardless of whether they are saved, allowing even the unbeliever to perform good deeds and see some truth. Those less in favor of common grace often emphasize the antithesis, the vast moral and intellectual gulf between those within the covenant of Christ and others. Historians, including James Bratt and Henry Zwanstra, identify 4 persistent groups or streams among Reformed Christians, 3 of which participate in this debate. The more progressive faction was the positive Neo-Calvinists. Their main interest was equipping their congregations to engage with and transform the world. They agreed with their more conservative counterparts on the need for separate organizations, Christian schools being a big example of this, but also encouraged participation in American ones, which they justified using the doctrine of common grace. The second of Bratt's factions were the antithetical Neo-Calvinists, who emphasized antithesis over common grace and believed in exerting their influence on culture through separate Reformed institutions. The third group was the confessionalists, who were skeptical of Kuyper's theology and believed that the church should primarily focus on religious matters. In this controversy, the antithetical Calvinists allied with the confessionalists against Jansen, despite disagreeing on some things theologically. Part of my approach to the debate within the magazines included studying rhetorical strategies and appeals to sources in relevant articles. For example, religion and culture articles often cite Kuyper, pictured here, and Herman Bavinck on theology and philosophy, but are also willing to cite secular thinkers on certain topics, with the acknowledgement that the worldview of these authors is inconsistent with their own. The Witness, by contrast, only cites authors that align with their perspectives unless they are refuting someone's argument, which they do frequently. The texts themselves are essential to study, but also the implicit details which often need to be read between the lines. Valuable insights often appeared where I least expected them. Some articles were obviously of interest, like one titled Jansen's Method, while others appeared unrelated but revealed important new information upon further inspection. Religion and Culture was founded in 1918 by its original editorial board, the 4 men pictured here, Reverend E.J. Took, H.J. Van Andel, R.B. Kuyper, and W.H. Delma. The first issue was published in May of 1919. It predates the Jansen conflict and was not created for the purpose of defending him. Its first 2 volumes were quarterly, while the subsequent 4 were monthly. The editorial staff would expand significantly through the magazine's existence to include numerous others, all of the positive Calvinist mentality. Seminary professor B.K. Kuyper was another important positive Calvinist who supported Religion and Culture and wrote for it a few times, but never served on its editorial board. The magazine's organizational structure changed in many ways over time. Editorials were significantly shortened, for instance, and monthly recurring articles were added. Religion and Culture always covered a wide variety of subjects, including art, history, philosophy, literature, psychology, and even the physical science in later years, though they consistently distrusted biology due to its association with evolution. They defended Jansen at the height of his controversy, but later shifted their focus to defending only the doctrine of common grace. The Witness was founded in 1921 and published its first edition in December of that year. Its original editorial board included anti-Jansen crusaders such as Y.P. de Young, Herman Hoeksema, Daniel Zweer, H.J. Kuyper, who is not pictured, and Samuel Volbada, who openly opposed Jansen's teaching. The Witness was founded as a response to religion and culture and to give a voice to the debate's other perspective. In the opening editorial, Louis Berkhoff states that its purpose is to discuss current issues from the perspective of the Bible and the Confessions. The Witness maintained a consistent structure throughout, featuring recurring monthly articles on topics such as our educational world, modern religious tendencies, and views on Scripture from the antithetical Calvinist perspective. Around half of the articles are in Dutch. Much of its content involves sounding the alarm against worldliness, arguing theologically against the methods of higher criticism, and attacking Ralph Jansen. While Religion and Culture addresses, as its title suggests, both religious and cultural subjects, The Witness is above all a religious periodical. The first stage of the conflict began in 1920 when the Seminary Curatorium examined Jansen's teachings for the first time. Prior to this, Religion and Culture consists mainly of social and intellectual topics addressed from a religious standpoint, as well as a few rather dense theological treatises. The editorial staff accepted submissions even from authors they did not agree with, so long as they were reformed. Herman Hoeksema himself submitted an address he delivered on Calvinism and the social Christianity movement to the August 1919 edition. A significant amount of the first two volumes consists of processing the aftermath of World War I and the future of global politics, including such pieces as In France by a Returning Soldier and The New Internationalism by E.J. Took. The first instance of the Jansen case being discussed in either magazine came in the November 1920 issue of Religion and Culture, in which Reverend E.J. Took warns that the church must not go beyond what is wise and prudent in defending the denomination against worldliness. He states that crisis can be avoided if love reigns and a real scientific temper of mind directs and controls our research and discussion. The first issue of Religion and Culture's new monthly format is dedicated almost completely to defending Jansen and encouraging denominational unity. One editor chides the denomination for being too serious-minded in sense of humor, while another warns against caricaturing one's opponent in debate in public criticism. A multi-page article by Garrett Hoeksema, no relation to Herman Hoeksema, a CRC pastor from Grand Rapids, defends Jansen's methodology and calls for a more favorable interpretation of his teaching. Even a satirical piece framed as a dialogue set in ancient Greece, the first of a long and popular series, defends Jansen implicitly, drawing out the conclusion that the theologian is not the perfect man and thus should not be held to a standard of perfection from Socrates' verbal opponent. Mentions of the controversy in the following issues included an argument that Synod meant well in giving Jansen a year's paid vacation in 1921, and a call to Jansen's students to remain loyal to the denomination and seminary, even as they remained loyal to him. After the August 1921 issue, Religion and Culture's defense of Jansen mainly consisted of calls for unity and warnings against religious fanaticism, rather than defending him directly. The Witness first responded in December. Articles from The Witness in 1922 are filled with anti-higher criticism and, by extension, anti-Jansen rhetoric. Jansen is frequently attacked by name, including by Herman Hoeksema, who happened to be Jansen's own pastor. The magazine received criticism for taking on a negative tone with many of its articles in another denominational magazine called The Watchman. It responded to this in an article titled Remarkable Reception. In this article, Berkhoff responded to the accusation that the editors had hidden ulterior motives and were an anti-Jansen organization. He claims that if this were true, the content of the magazine would only be negative. Rather, The Witness was simply raising the alarms about modernism and worldliness that no one else would. There are articles in The Witness with a positive tone, one example being the use of songs by the New Testament Church, in which the author praises how Reformed church members express themselves spiritually through the Psalms. However, the existence of positive examples does not mean that the Watchman's criticism was unfounded. Interestingly, Berkhoff also refers to The Witness as a counterpart to Religion and Culture, but from my thorough study, the witness responds to religion and culture, mostly negatively, far more frequently than religion and culture responds to the witness. Its editors implicitly place Jansen on the same tier of error as the authors of the higher critical Bible, which completely removes certain passages of the Bible deemed unnecessary. In one article, Hoeksema claims that the witness was being unfairly criticized for discussing Jansen, when everyone else was doing the same thing. In the March 1922 edition, Burkhoff, in reviewing a pamphlet Jansen wrote, stated that his conclusions often conflict with all sound logic. Daniel Zweer later wonders what is stopping Jansen from facing his opponents in a debate. This pattern continues even after Hoeksema is no longer on the editorial staff. Both publications continue addressing other topics as well, especially religion and culture. These discussions tend to revolve around social questions and Americanization, as well as developments in American culture. Questions including, shall we have world peace after World War I, and is tobacco a gift of common grace, were considered from a positive Kuyperian perspective. They also review a diverse array of literature, including fiction such as Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, History of Philosophy by Tiered Hoekstra, and Within the Gateways of the Far East by Charles R. Erdman. Often, if an author did not hold the Reformed point of view, the reviewer was still able to find something positive to say about their work. The authors of The Witness, by contrast, tended to be hypercritical of anyone who did not hold their views. Their reaction to the Americanization question was to sound the alarm against a growing epidemic of worldliness. The CRC Synod convened again in 1922 as a response to the anti-Jansen campaign in pamphlets and church-related magazines. Synod summoned Jansen to defend his teachings in person, but he refused, citing procedural errors in the case against him. According to Bratt, B.K. Kuyper identified 24 such mistakes, including that delegates to Synod had been chosen in an atmosphere of hysteria. In late 1922, the Confessionalists of the Witness, including Y.P. de Young and Daniel Zweer, removed Herman Hoeksema from the editorial board and distanced themselves from the antitheticals as a result of a few articles in Religion and Culture comparing the antitheticals to Anabaptists because they did not believe in common grace. This represented a shift in the focus of the main theological conflict being Jansen to being common grace and antithesis. In response, Hoeksema and Danhoff launched a new pamphleteering campaign focused on Kuyper's antithetical theology. Religion and Culture continued arguing that Calvin, Kuyper, and Bobbing taught and believed in common grace. Both sides used scripture to show that their Kuyper's theology was biblically based. The Synod of 1924 has gained a reputation as the Common Grace Synod because it affirmed that common grace was sound doctrine. This gives the false impression that this synod was progressive and pro-Americanization. Its actions did not reflect this. Synod hinted that the opponents of Hoeksema and Danhoff were biased and praised the two pastors' warnings against conformity to the world. Following this, Religion and Culture shifted their main focus to religion over culture, increasingly condemning the liberalism in America in articles such as Organic Objectivism. The Witness continued business as usual, emphasizing the antithesis in articles including Antithesis and Common Grace, which I translated that title from Dutch, but with less of a sense of urgency in their tone. In the aftermath of his firing, Ralph Jansen never held another teaching position, instead working as a stockbroker. Herman Hoeksema would later be expelled from the church in 1925 for refusing to subscribe to the doctrine of common grace. 1928 marked the end of the pro-Americanization period, as Synod issued a statement condemning worldliness, specifically in the forms of dancing, playing cards, and going to the movies. B.K. Kuyper, one of the strongest supporters of both Jansen and positive Calvinism, was fired from his seminary position for going to the movies after disregarding official warnings not to. Thus, what Bratt calls the decisive decade of Americanization came to an end. Though the CRC rejected the extremes of both the antithetical and positive Calvinist positions, it would place more emphasis on the antithesis in the decades ahead. The outcomes of the Jansen and Common Grace controversies continued to echo through future conflicts in the CRC. Debates of a similar spirit continued to occur roughly every generation. These include concerns about idealist philosophy among seminary faculty in 1927 and 28, women's role in the church and creation versus evolution in the 80s and 90s, and today's debates related to sexuality. The questions addressed in these controversies remain how much the CRC ought to be reformed in the world amidst cultural change, and this is always addressed from a theological viewpoint. The common grace debate continues to have implications in the wider story of the Christian Reformed Church. It also mirrors, though is separate from, the broader fundamentalist modernist tensions. American Protestant denominations wrestled with their stance on the new social norms of the 1920s, which were less restrictive and more cosmopolitan than previous decades. The common grace debate in the CRC reveals how one group, distinct from both fundamentalists and what we would consider mainline American Protestants, underwent parallel or overlapping conflicts. As part of this project, I had an opportunity to learn about archival work and digital humanities by digitizing every single edition of both magazines, 97 issues in total. Pictured on this slide are 2 pages of the Jansen's Method article from Religion and Culture. And on this slide, the first little section of Need for Clarification, the article in which Jansen's conclusions are said to conflict with all logic. These magazines will soon be available in their entirety on Heckman Library's Digital Commons. I've learned many valuable lessons through this process, including what makes an archival quality digital scan and the importance of patience. To do this work, you must realize that you will need to redo something at some point. Understanding my mistakes and that they could be fixed made the process less frustrating. Working on both historical research and archival work at the same time taught me many things I would not have learned had I only done traditional research. As a double major in data science with a minor in computer science, I was excited to use digital tools to aid in research for a historiographical project. Working so closely with the sources helped me appreciate them more. By the time I actually started reading through the magazines, I had been glancing at article titles while scanning. So while the task of reading so much material still felt daunting, I had an idea of where certain things were going. The scanning also ended up being an asset to my research process. I'm able to take the PDFs everywhere I go on a flash drive, allowing me to read them outside of Heritage Hall's normal hours, as the physical magazines must remain there. These digitized versions may simplify the process of future research using these sources. There's much potential for further study of the magazines, including the poetry, advertisements, meditations on scripture, and many things that I didn't even have time to mention today. Another possibility is creating a database of all the editions and analyzing them rhetorically. Now these sources will be easily accessible, making such future work possible. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Doug Howard. I had a lot of fun thinking about what you guys probably thought when you saw that poster, with Taylor's topic. Oh, that Howard, he's retired, but he finally dragooned a student into putting together his 2 favorite subjects, turkey and cars. But, okay, so I'll admit that I was responsible for like half of that, but really, it wasn't my doing, it was Taylor's. So I got to tell you the backstory here. So, probably 25 years ago, like late May, when the campus is practically deserted and everybody's gone home, I was sitting in my office, and I forget if it was, Professor Ed Bucht or maybe it was Bruce Berglund. Somebody stuck their head in my office. Yeah, and said, "Hey, the library has some extra funding at the end of the fiscal year." Can you imagine that? So if you really want something, you better go ask for it now. Okay, so I quick grabbed this brochure that I had just gotten from the National Archives and went to see Glenn Reynolds, who at the time was library director. And I don't remember that it took me much convincing for Glenn to buy this 80 reels of microfilm, records of the Department of State relating to the internal affairs of Turkey, 1910 to 1929. And students started writing papers based on that archival material. As they did so, they got interested in Admiral Mark Bristol, the United States representative in Istanbul in the years following the First World War, exactly the period that Noel was just talking about, but on the other side of the ocean. And I would add, the most important American in the history of the Middle East, and he's almost unheard of. Well, students learned that Admiral Bristol's papers actually are in the Library of Congress. So an enterprising group of them took a spring break trip and went to Washington, D.C., and sat in the Library of Congress and photographed and scanned a ton of those. And okay, they weren't the quality that Professor Katerberg and Noel would find, but then I was able to go and capture a bunch more of them. So we almost had the entire run of Admiral Bristol's War Diaries now. Okay, so that's my part. But then the other part of the paper, the part about cars, honestly, was Taylor's doing. So Taylor grew up in Pontiac, went to Lake Orion High School, graduated there in 2022. When she came to Calvin in the fall of 22, and in her years, she worked at Campus Safety Office. She's been involved in Night Investment Management Club, Political Dialogue and Action Club. But during the summers back home, she had lots of jobs and internships, including working in a small law firm that has confirmed her desire to go to law school. So I'm happy to tell you that she will go to University of Detroit University Law School this fall. But also, she worked at Meadowbrook Hall, a historic house museum in Rochester Hills built by Matilda Dodge Wilson, heiress of the Dodge fortune. And then last summer, Taylor interned at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. If you ask about that in the Q&A, she'll tell you a little more about what she actually did. It's very interesting work. So it was Taylor who, reading through Admiral Bristol's papers last fall, said to me, there's a lot of talk about cars in these papers, including Fords. So she went on, she learned that Ford actually built a plant in Istanbul in the 1920s. That's where her paper began. So using her contacts at the Ford Museum, when she got home from the winter, what do you call it now, intensive in Venice, she actually she took the initiative, set up a research trip for herself to go to the Ford archive and sat there for a couple days reading Ford documents about the plant in Turkey. And the result is this original research paper that she wants to present. And the topic, Admiral Mark L. Bristol and American Automobiles, the failed Ford assembly plant in 1923. So join me in welcoming Taylor Campbell.
I've been using the observations of Admiral Mark L. Bristol to study how American businesses entered Turkey, and that's specifically in this case through the Ford assembly plant. And in this presentation, I will be focusing on the question, why did the Ford assembly plant in Istanbul fail? Well, that answer is vastly complex, and I won't address all of those reasons. One of the reasons I observed through these papers for the failure was this disconnect between Ford Motor Company's goals and the reality that Admiral Mark Bristol documents in his papers. So between those two perspectives, some of the key misunderstandings I see is misunderstandings of the historical context, the state of infrastructure, and the really changing relations between nations at the time. And like Professor Howard said, my key sources are really Admiral Mark L. Bristol's war diaries, which cover really his personal records for his time in Istanbul, and records from the Ford Motor Company records at Benson Research Center. I'll talk throughout the rest of the presentation about some of my other sources, so I'll bring some of those major scholars up, but before we get to the actual factory, it's crucial really to understand the context we're coming into here. So by the 1920s, we're looking at a completely different world than what existed in the decade prior. Most importantly for us, the Ottoman Empire has collapsed following the First World War. Under the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, the empire was set to be fully dismantled. Consequently, this was a time of tremendous transition. During World War I, the population of Anatolia was devastated, decreasing by about 20%. Existing infrastructure was also quite limited, with development of the railroad being one of the only really successful projects prior to collapse. Conflict also persisted with the Greco-Turkish War, and that ended in 1923 with the Treaty of Lausanne, replacing the Treaty of Sèvres entirely. Amidst this social and political turmoil, the economy was also struggling quite significantly. Under the first treaty, European powers were managing organizations like the Public Debt Administration, and under the second treaty, both debt and the implementation of tariffs have become a very important concern here. While the 170 million in lira of war debt had been written off because it was to Germany, the consolidated debt of the Ottoman Empire remained, with about 65% falling on Turkey, and that was totaling about 78 million lira. So as Turkey navigates this, Americans, as well as their businesses, were trying to enter the country, often very much misunderstanding the New World situation. So from that perspective is, of course, my main source of information, Admiral Mark L. Bristol, and he was the senior United States naval officer as well as a United States High Commissioner, where he was pretty much the highest ranking American official in the region, despite the time him being there, not really having formal relations between the United States and Turkey. He enters Istanbul in 1919 and is there until 1927, and in that time he balances a wide variety of issues, including the conflicts of the Turkish War of Independence, the Greco-Turkish War I mentioned, Russian refugee crisis, and many more events, along with his goals of trying to see the vision for how America would be here over the next decades, really. So in that context, he really recognized the importance of American businesses. With companies like Standard Oil of New York and industries like tobacco, stakes were very high for Americans trying to define what their market power would be in the Middle East. In turn, many officials went straight to Bristol. So in his statements, he really establishes quite a few themes. He generally advised Americans from the perspective of the open door policy. First, he was concerned about American interests really falling behind the already present European companies. As he wrote in this one quote here, European powers were taking the cream, butter, and cheese, leaving us the skimmed milk that was left over. He also developed strong opinions through these interactions and was using businessmen quite heavily to really try and get a fair deal, as he said, for Americans. He also emphasized that American businessmen needed to connect to Turkish professionals and producers, not just work through the existing European intermediaries. For the sake of long-term American growth, he recognized that American businesses needed to move abroad, but it needed to be done carefully and strategically. Furthermore, he noted some of the many biases Americans held, while he also distinguished Turkey as this part of the world. He repeatedly recognized the necessity of these companies, if they want to establish friendly relationships, to have a different approach than some of what had happened with the American Christian missionaries before. And finally, he acknowledged that there was great potential in Turkey, though often he had many reservations that he mentioned. He notes that the Turkish people should have a fair chance to show what they could do. And more people consulted Bristol in his time there, and he developed this firsthand based experience to give advice to them. However, most did not listen, and that we get to Ford. So among the many companies entering, there were numerous automobile companies there, some including Dodge, Chrysler, Studebaker, and of course, Ford Motor Company. So probably know enough about Ford as it is, but it was launched in 1903 as Henry Ford's third attempt at car manufacturing and became a global influence with the Model T. Almost immediately after that, Ford was looking abroad, looking straight to Canada, right across the border. That was only the beginning. He started factories in England, Ireland, and Germany, eventually Japan, as well as other projects that are captured in one of my sources' books, Mira Wilkins and her 4 on 6 Continents. He also, as he expanded, he also had some more moral goals and expressed those with things like wanting to put purpose first, then profit. But in this global expansion, we of course reached Istanbul. So he established this plant in a former small weapons factory in Tophané, one of the oldest military hubs in the city. And I'll talk more about it being in a free trade zone a little bit later, but I won't leave you in suspense. Obviously, it fails pretty quickly. It opens in 1929, and it closed in 1944, but ceased production long before that, only really doing repairs and selling some parts, but not fully assembling parts. So the next few slides, I do a few pictures that I found at the Benson Ford Research Center. So I thought these were really helpful to visualize both inside, what it looks like with their assembly line, what some of the cars they would have held here actually looked like. It was really interesting experience, as you can imagine the factory, but this I think really brings it to life more. But that brings me back to the main question I'm looking at, and that is, why did it fail? Well, considering the factory, one of the most important scholars, very recent, is the work of Asla Odman's dissertation. So she very recently presented, just last year, her dissertation, which is called Ford Motor Company's Assembly Plant in Tophané, Istanbul, 1923 to 1944, Territoriality and Automobility during interwar global capitalism. So she spent about 20 years researching this project, and just earlier last year was when she actually presented it. And she used some of the same sources, so from Ford's archive, as well as from the Turkish government, to study this plant as a failed project. And she looks through the lens of global spatial entanglements. So along with including many of the details that I really needed to learn from in her paper, she argues that the plant failed largely because of miscalculation of global, national, and local scales. For her, Ford's worldview on borders was not consistent with the reality of the current world. And while she covers Ford Motor Company's missteps extensively, she doesn't utilize Ford Bristol's perspective, who often noted the same problems just in the time rather than 100 years later. So by adding Bristol to this, I'll be looking at some of those gaps between Ford Motor Company's hopes and the reality Bristol was very much familiar with. Now, for one, Ford and Bristol had different understandings of the impact of the immediate historical context of Turkey. So looking at the time frame of the factory's existence, it'd be pretty easy to blame the Great Depression right at the beginning and World War II for its failure. You could chalk it up to that. However, it's pretty quickly apparent that Ford Motor Company, along with many Americans, had underestimated the financial problems that already existed in Turkey. According to Ford Motor Company's annual report in 1931, they state that we are therefore doing everything possible to correct the situation, but the commercial conditions in the Near East are peculiar and awkward, even in the best of times. Different treatment, longer credit, and higher proportionate to investment than other places are required. So largely, Ford seemed to be caught somewhat off guard by the situation. While factories had been really hit or miss with being successful across the globe, Istanbul clearly did not work as they expected. However, Bristol had already taken note of many of these dangers and frequently shared those with the American businessmen he was discussing this with. By his later years, he was even more explicit. In 1927, he wrote that in one discussion, he talked about how bluntly that the present time, the financial needs are, Turkey has basically no credit. Had Ford Motor Company understood that these debts were still relevant or listened to some of these warnings, he may have been better prepared in entering the market. Another problem with that really hindered Ford's ability to succeed in Istanbul was his belief that a singular piece of technology could function worldwide. He said in this one quote to his lawyer very early in Ford Motor Company that the proper system, as I have in mind, is to get the car to the people. If you can get people together so they get and get an idea of neighborliness, the car will have a universal effect. You won't have any more strikes or wars. So obviously this is pretty optimistic. It played a very clear role in the interwar period. It's definitely not practical. That map there comes from first 4-year reflection from Ford Motor Company. It kind of captures what he envisioned the world with the factories and how it looked from his worldview. It's interesting how there aren't really borders drawn, but there are the continents. So that's, I think, a very good visual to understand how Ford approached it. But in Bristol's war diaries, he regularly commented on the state of roads and often in how he was getting places. One of the most significant experiences he wrote about, I think, was when he and his chauffeur were driving and they accidentally hit a young girl. And it wasn't a serious accident. She ended up being fine, mostly because they were driving at such a slow speed. But he took frequent note of the conditions of the road. Bristol said children, old people, and young people have a way of dashing across the street in the most unexpected way, without looking in any direction, and it is always a wonder that there are not more accidents. As is apparent in Bristol's on-the-ground experience, integrating American cars into ancient cities like Istanbul, as something that's observed in many of the locations he puts in the factories, was more challenging than Ford really fully understood. And finally, the borders of Turkey as a single country, not as the Ottoman Empire, was After the first free zone law of the Republic passed with general support from the government on June 21st of 1927, Ford Motor Company was finally really able to begin the formation of its factory. Specific negotiations went down between Ford Representative William G. Collins and the Turkish Minister of Finance Saraçoğlu in November of 1928. He was especially hopeful that the foreign firm would help revive Istanbul's port. However, the resulting Ford law that came in 1929 was more controversial than the free zone itself. While at least a portion of the labor force had to be Turkish, a number of concessions made it unpopular with officials. Under this law, Ford Motor Company was expected to make minimal purchases in the local economy, was not expected to use the Turkish language, and was really given a clear advantage over the competitors. This was especially unpopular among Istanbul merchants and port authorities, and at the time was cited in some Turkish press as a warehouse crisis. While he was also avoiding the tariffs in Turkey in 1929, Ford Motor Company was also trying to establish connections in the Soviet Union. With Soviet demand for ports and tractors and the development of factories, William G. Collins, the same Ford representative, noted that this was a place of strategic value to have an assembly plant. And he said it was the closest, most developed port to Soviet Russia. And this is in part of Oman's argument that the strategic placement of the factory created more of a knot place, so it wasn't really within the city, like, existing there, name only really. And at first, it seemed that Ford might have been able to get away with escaping the typical confines of national borders and local laws. However, Bristol made it clear from his first interactions with Ford representatives that this would be an unwise move and that he didn't really advise some of these strategies. One debate he had with Collins was over the hiring of non-Americans in leadership roles or in people's nationalities. In March of 1929, he wrote, "I then attacked Collins for having anything but Americans representing an American company like Ford in foreign countries." A year later, he spoke with another Ford representative. When Bristol was relatively pleased with the progress in negotiations, he said, "I advised him very strongly to have his company only utilize Americans and Turks as the personnel in this establishment." He continues and says, he also referred to the Englishman who was in charge of the Ford establishment in Trieste, and I told him that, in my opinion, that man had been responsible for the unsuccessful conclusion of negotiations about a year ago. As Ford Motor Company was really driving itself towards failure, even before it established the free zone, Bristol had recognized some of the diplomatic mistakes that Ford was making, and gave advice that he was not necessarily willing to implement. Considering these observations, there are many fields of study coming together, both in terms of Bristol's knowledge and how we would understand that now. And understanding them requires use of a wide variety of secondary sources. Some through Turkish history, I included from Vanderlip's The Terrible Turk to understand that perspective that Bristol's kind of countering and give some broader context. This 2008 publication, A Brief History of the Late Ottoman Empire. For Bristol, the sources are generally pretty limited, though he's involved in a few works included there. But as I've mentioned throughout, some of the most important scholars in understanding this factory and Ford as a whole are Wilkins and Odlum. And that puts this factory, as well as just being a broadly historical topic, in the context of business history, which tends to focus more on case studies and metrics. So as a field that's technically distinct from economic history and company history, business history in the United States tends to start with NSB Gross's Business History Review, and by the late 60s and 70s, scholars including Chandler, Cole, and Cochran had really defined this field as something to study structure, culture, and management of specific corporations. Typically, this is how broadly successful companies like Ford are understood. However, more recent historians have begun to challenge this focus on management, as well as the disconnect with some other disciplines. So in 2013, two scholars, Scranton and Friedson, published Reimagining Business History, and later in the 2010s, in the companion's Business History, this chapter, A Revisionist Historiography of Business History, was published. So these start to really recognize some of the problems with really focusing on big business, avoiding the role of the state, and often putting an American-centered view at the center of business history. Crucially, these scholars also emphasize the need to study failure, which brings us back to this factory that we're looking at now. So few scholars really acknowledging this or putting much thought into the factory. It's a big question of why would this failure matter? And in most economic reviews of Turkish automotive history, this factory doesn't even get mentioned, which I think is interesting. They often frame the industry as starting in the 1960s, and often, at best, right after World War II. And before Odwin, details about the factory itself were pretty scarce. But as a failure, this factory tells a much more complete story of not only Ford's expansion abroad, but broader relations between the United States and Turkey. This factory also tells us an important story of the disconnect that can happen between diplomats and foreign business interests. Well, failure is not often a very attractive story to tell, especially in business history. Both scholars and companies want to see success. But looking at these gaps, it's clear that Ford entered Turkey unprepared, and that Bristol's warnings often went unrecognized. So by studying this factory, I was able to learn a lot about the 1920s in Turkey from a perspective I really didn't expect, and I hope you all learned some